Welcome to the March 22nd, 2025 episode of The Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and the working title for today's show is Big Oil Thugs Want to Use Emergency Act to Force Pipelines on Canadians. Tune in, folks. This is going to be a fiery show. I'm fired up about this. I'll get into the argument in just a moment. But first, a public service announcement. It's my birthday today. Be gentle in the comments, please. Some of you are not. I notice your rudeness. You know, on this day, if no other, be nice to me. Okay. 2 days ago, I did a show about the March 18th open letter to Canadian political leaders from the oil and gas industry. There's 14 CEOs. Most of them were for oil and gas companies. There were some pipeline companies. And they sent this letter to all of the political leaders, not just Liberal Prime Minister Mark Carney, but all of them. And it had a list of demands, and the most extraordinary was they want to use, they're suggesting, almost demanding, that the federal government, the government of Canada, use the Emergency Powers Act to force pipelines through to the West Coast or the East Coast or even the North Coast, for that matter. You know what the Emergency Act used to be called? The previous version of it? The War Measures Act. That's what it's meant to be. Really extraordinary circumstances like a war. Maybe it's a huge flood. We'll get into that in a minute. I'm going to go through parts of the Emergency Act to explain what they could have argued, but they didn't argue. They argued for something else that's far worse. That's why I call them thugs. This is thuggery, folks. And Canadians deserve to be pissed off about it because I am. I'm going to show you why. Okay, so what first? I'm going to read. First of all, I'm going to read from this letter. Okay, so this is a quote. By declaring a Canadian energy crisis and key projects in the national interest, the federal government will be able to use all available emergency powers to ensure that the dramatic regulatory restructuring required to expand the oil and gas, natural gas sector is rapidly achieved. Okay, some key things in here. First of all available emergency powers. That means the Emergency Act. I suppose there might be other legislation, but that's really what we're getting at here. They've been mad for years at the current Liberal government for changes to the Environmental Impact Assessment Act and that's Bill C-69 and then Bill C-48, which banned oil tanker traffic off the northwest coast of British Columbia. They've been really upset about that. This is not new. They've been, aside from them wanting to use emergency powers to force it through. And then key in on this word, expand the oil and natural gas sector, and they want to do it quickly. Never let a good crisis go to waste, folks. Now, I want another quote for you from the letter. The federal government has an opportunity to reset its policies and regulatory frameworks to support oil and gas and natural gas investment and remove the barriers that we have imposed on ourselves over time. And one of its 5 demands, because there are 5 there in the bullets in the last page, is to grow production. The federal government's unlegislated cap on emissions must be eliminated to allow the sector to reach its full potential. Okay, they're talking about the federal oil and gas emissions cap, which Prime Minister Mark Carney says that if he wins the election, which is supposed to be called tomorrow, that he will stick with the emissions cap. Might be structured differently. It's a fair argument, but he's sticking with it, and they are not happy with this. But what about this full potential? What does that mean? Well, Danielle Smith, Premier of Alberta, has told us in plain words over and over and over again. Press releases, public comments. She wants to double Alberta oil production. Double it. Alberta is already, Canada's the fourth largest oil producer in the world behind the US, Russia, Saudi Arabia. It's Canada. And Alberta makes up the bulk of that. It's 4 million barrels a day. So if she wants to double it, that means 8 million barrels a day. 8 million barrels a day. And they want to get it to market, to the coasts, not down to the US, to the coasts by pipeline. That is the equivalent of eight, nine, maybe 10 Trans Mountain expansion pipelines, which just was completed not too long ago at the cost of $34 billion. Okay, so I'm going to show you the argument they could have used because this is really important. Had they done this differently, I might be a little more sympathetic. Not a whole lot, but somewhat more sympathetic to this. So here's what they could have done. Now, Donald Trump has threatened to put tariffs on all Canadian goods. And he's already put some on steel and aluminum. And then April 2nd, we're going to see what else he puts them on because it's kind of crazy and chaotic, and we're not entirely sure where this is all going. But he said 10% on oil and gas. And the reason for that is very simple. American refiners rely a lot on Canadian oil. And if they don't get it, they're going to have a hard time finding substitutes, which means gas prices go up and his voters are unhappy, and they're already unhappy. So he doesn't want to do that too much. But that's introduced a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And what they could have said is that threat from the United States, and of course, the accompanying threat of annexation, let's not forget that, which implies military invasion of some kind, all of that could be construed as a national crisis. And that it would be in the national interest then um, to reroute the export of that oil. Uh, it would take a lot of pipelines, but and in response to Trump's tariffs. But that's not what they argued. They didn't argue that at all. What they argued for was an expansion of production. They want to produce more, sell more, and make more money. That's the whole point here. And that's not what the Emergency Act is designed for. It's not. Okay, so let's talk about the Emergency Act. The latest example of its use and the convention in Canada, and remember, under the Westminster system, not everything is in a code, in a law, in a criminal statute, whatever. We have conventions, we have traditions, things that have been done this way for decades for a reason. And the convention is that the Emergency Act not be invoked except for the most dire circumstances. Now, the last time we used it was in 2022. We basically had, for American viewers, you had the January 6th, 2020, call it insurrection, the assault on the Capitol from Donald Trump's supporters. Well, we had a similar kind of thing in 2022 where a bunch of truckers and, dozens of trucks, and they occupied the nation's capital in Ottawa, and they honked their horns all night long and drove people crazy, and they just wouldn't go. And the Ottawa police couldn't make them go, and the Ontario Premier Doug Ford refused to use the provincial police, and so there was nobody else to act, and so the federal government had to act, and they invoked the Emergency Powers Act. And there was a huge debate about whether that occupation of the Capitol was a sufficient reason to invoke those powers. Imagine that. The Capitol is literally being occupied by people, some of whom wanted to replace the government and were very open and held press conferences about it. Okay? So this is not undertaken lightly. But here's how it works. Here's what the government has to do. First of all, they have to declare a public welfare emergency. Okay? So they the letter referred to a national crisis, national interest. That's essentially what it would, the technically public welfare emergency. So what is a public welfare emergency? Well, the Act tells you what it is. Fire, flood, drought, storm, earthquake, or other natural phenomenon. Okay. Disease in human beings, animals, or plants. Okay, so like the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic that we had in 2020, right? Started in 2020, that would qualify as a public welfare emergency. It is pretty serious. I mean, a lot of Canadians died. Accident or pollution, like if you had a pipeline leak, for example, a huge one, and it was polluting, water bodies and aquifers and drinking water. So that would be one. Or something that results or may result in a danger to life or property, social disruption, or a breakdown in the flow of essential goods, services, and here's the critical one, resources, so serious as to be a national emergency. Now, there's no real definition of national emergency here because, that's a kind of a pliable kind of concept. And the government of the day has to make that decision of what constitutes a national emergency. But see, what they could do here is say, look, we're threatened by another country. Our sovereignty is threatened. The oil and gas is far and away Canada's biggest export. It's about 100 billion to 120 billion a day. It's twice what automobiles are, and they're in second place. So it's a threat to the Canadian economy. It's a threat to jobs. It's a threat to government revenue. Both the Alberta government in particular and the federal government, both of them get significant revenue. Tens. I think Alberta gets about 20 billion, $24 billion a year from royalties and taxes related to oil and gas, and the federal government gets tens of billions, maybe 20, something like that. But it's in that order of magnitude. So you could argue that this is a crisis and that and it's we should, Canada should invoke the Emergency Act to deal with it. And we would have a debate, and there would be, the pro side and the con side would have their discussion, and a decision would be made. We'd all have to live with it, and that's where it would go. But the oil thugs didn't do that. Instead, they used the argument that those powers only reserved for emergencies should be used to simply expand production and exports because there was an opportunity. And they didn't like going through the current process, which is cumbersome and there's lots of consultation and it's they wanted from the time that the project is filed with the Canadian Energy Regulator, they wanted it to be approved in 6 months, not 6 years, 6 months. How you can't, the Constitution of Canada requires that Aboriginal people under Section 35 be consulted on major projects like this. And that's always been the Achilles heel of these kinds of projects. The government isn't good at consulting and the industry isn't good at consulting, and it takes a lot to satisfy the requirements under the Constitution. They want that to be shoved down the throats of First Nations and Indigenous communities. That's the only logical explanation for this. And if you take Trans Mountain expansion or even the Coastal Gas Link, which is a natural gas pipeline from northeastern BC down to Kitimat, where they're building the LNG Canada, we saw Burnaby, the city of Burnaby. I reported on one of their big protest rallies. They had thousands of people there. People were really upset because new pipeline went right through their city of a couple 100,000 people. No big surprise. The city of Burnaby sued the government, sued the regulator, sued the company. I forget who all they sued, but they sued the government of BC, sued. All of those lawsuits, all of the foot dragging by the city of Burnaby delayed Trans Mountain expansion. It's one of the reasons why Kinder Morgan bailed on it, and the government of Canada had to pick it up and complete it. So the industry doesn't like that. And so it wants to do away with that by abrogating Canadian rights. That's wrong. I'm sorry. I'm all for making the process efficient. If there's an economic case for a pipeline and we have to build one and we want to make it efficient, I mean, we're under a threat from Trump. We get it. We have to move quickly. But stomping all over people's rights to do it, communities' rights, indigenous rights, that is not the Canadian way. And there's no way. And the Canadian media, as far as I can tell, has completely ignored this part of it. And it's all through the letter. Like they're not trying to hide it. It's very clear. And as far as I can see, Energy Media is the only news outlet that is bothering even to talk about this. And it's outrageous that they would do this. Okay, so once a public welfare emergency has been declared, then the government can decide where where the emergency powers will be used. So the last one was in Ottawa. The government could say, okay, we're building a pipeline out from Alberta, from Hardisty, where the hub is, oil hub, and we're going to build it to the west coast, maybe Burnaby, maybe Port Rupert up in the north, wherever we're going to build it. And along that route, or in BC generally, we're going to apply the Emergency Act in order to quell resistance. Or maybe even maybe they do it in part of Alberta as well. But they can specify where this goes. Okay, fair enough. And every 90 days, the invocation of the act expires. It has to be renewed every 90 days. This gives you an idea of the framers of this legislation didn't want this to be used indefinitely. 3 months, that's all you get, and then you have to justify it again. And you probably, I'm not quite sure about this, but I wouldn't be surprised if they have to bring it, though they wouldn't have to bring it back to Parliament, but they might be debated in Parliament, might be demanded that it be debated in Parliament. I mean, you can see how this would go. I mean, it's not meant to be a permanent state of affairs. This is not martial law. This is deal with the issue at hand, whatever it is, and then move on. I suppose war would be different. So fair enough there. Um, so how do we conclude this? What are we to say? I mean, you're asking the Canadian government to basically steamroll over Canadians in order to facilitate the building of infrastructure for the primary benefit of oil and gas companies that are based in Alberta, and frankly, from some of the studies I've seen, are more than 50% owned by people outside Canada. So the profits that they uh, that they distribute in the form of dividends and share buybacks to prop up the stock price, all of those go mostly to Americans or investors outside of Canada. Why would we do that? Okay. And I should point out that Alberta Premier Danielle Smith said very clearly, I support exactly what the CEOs are asking for in that letter. Now, whether Danielle Smith read the letter, I probably not. And given the level of competence in the premier's office, probably nobody even explained to her that these. But on the other hand, they should. You shouldn't go around endorsing things that you haven't read or some of your staff have read and not understand the implications. But if she did understand it, that's even worse. Because as yesterday, I interviewed Stewart Prest, who is a political science professor out of the University of British Columbia. I've interviewed him for years. Really thoughtful, not prone to exaggeration, doesn't get all wound up about politics, but explains the science behind, not the science behind it, explains the logic, the arguments, the evidence, the data. That's Stewart. And he said, this is an extension of Trumpism. The MAGA movement down in the US that Trump leads, that is just destroying the federal government in the course of 2 months there. I mean, Elon Musk and his Doge, Department of Government Efficiency, he said, the same animus is behind this. This is what's often called the Maple MAGA. The CEOs of some of Canada's largest companies should not be trying to employ the thuggery that is a hallmark of the MAGA movement in the US and to a large extent the Maple MAGA movement in Canada. That is wrong. And somebody needs to stand up and oppose it. Instead, we've got the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, talking about, oh, let's build pipelines, and premiers are talking about building pipelines. And here, the very industry that wants it done is asking for the invocation of the Emergency Act. This is a sad day for Canada, folks, and nobody's going to know about it except those who watch this video. Spread this far and wide. And I want to say this because I get accused of this all the time in the comments and on social media and to my face, which is okay, by the way. I don't hate the oil and gas industry. I worked in it for 5 years. And in fact, if you look at the work that I've done in the past, I argue that the oil sands bitumen, which makes up like 80% of Alberta's oil production, should actually be transitioned over time into using feedstock to make carbon fiber, asphalt binder, activated carbon, and other materials, non-combustion kinds of things. So that's kind of where the great demand for that in global markets. And so what that would mean is that the production side of the oil sands in particular would remain as it is. Except what you would do is you would create a domestic market for that product. Instead of shipping in a pipeline to the US refineries, you would ship it down to, maybe Edmonton and the Industrial Heartland Association, and you would have a manufacturing industry there that would use it. And so, but that doesn't mean that I rubber stamp everything the industry does. In fact, I'll tell you a little story. 2 years ago, it was September of 2023, and the World Petroleum Congress was on in Calgary, and it was a big 3-day event, and everybody in the oil industry was there. And I wanted to interview Kendall Dillon, who is the CEO of the Pathways Alliance, which is the oil sands companies, kind of their trade association. That'll help you understand it. And their press guy took me out for coffee because I'd asked for an interview and they had granted it, but he wanted to do a little pre-interview chat. And in the course of it, he said, "You're perceived as being hostile to the industry." And I was taken back. I said, "I'm not hostile. I'm a critic because you guys don't do everything correctly. You've got all sorts of huge problems, like hundreds of billions of dollars of unfunded environmental liabilities and emissions that are amongst the highest in the world. And this is not. We're not on teams here. You can be generally supportive of something and still be highly critical of it because it needs to be criticized. So don't put me down as reflexively knee-jerk critic or hater of oil and gas. That's not the case. We're in an energy transition. We're going to need oil and gas for a while, and it may as well be Canadian oil and gas. But you can't do this kind of stuff. This is not ethical. Ethical oil is one of the terms that gets bandied about Canadian oil and gas. You can't be ethical and demand that the Emergency Act be invoked in order to satisfy your business plan. Anyway, I'm going to be talking more about this as the election campaign goes on, because I have no doubt that pipelines are going to be a very large part of this, and the expansion of the Alberta oil and gas industry will be a very large part of the campaign. So stay tuned because we're not done with this topic yet.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.